Some of the major components that you would need to make a carbide lathe cutting tool are square steel bar, carbide cutter, copper pipe, and wood for the handle. I started by measuring the 1/2-inch square steel bar, 18 inches out for a cut, 8.5 inches for the tool, and about 9.5 inches for inside the handle for support. Here I used a reciprocating saw to cut the steel bar at the 18-inch mark because that's all I had laying around, and it did the job pretty well. Next, I needed to make 2 marks on the end of the steel, one for the carbide cutter to sit in, and the next to remove the material under the carbide cutter so it does not get caught on the lathe while turning. I ended up using a CI0 round carbide cutter from Easy Wood Tools, which also came with the screw. I used a pair of digital calipers to measure the thickness of the round carbide cutter, which I'm then transferring that thickness to the end of the steel bar. It's not crucial, but I tried to make the carbide cutter even with the top of the steel. Here I'm just double checking to make sure that it is the right length. You really want the carbide cutter to hang over on the edge in the front and on both sides. Here is the second mark, about a 45-degree angle, just hand marked, and then I brought over to the grinder to remove that material up to the line or close to the line. This is where I put my big head in front of the camera. Now I bring it over to the belt sander and clean it up. I get it right up to the line, and it was approximately about 45 degrees. Here's where I got innovative. I used a Dremel tool and a Dremel tool router table with a metal cutting wheel to cut the platform where the carbide cutter is going to sit. It was crucial that I get this flat so it's parallel with the bottom of the tool, so when it sits on the tool rest on your lathe, you'll know that the cutter is exactly parallel with that and to the floor. The only issue with this method is that it does leave a little piece of steel above the platform that needed to be removed after, but it did a really good job with the table and the cutter of cutting it perfectly flat and parallel to the bottom of the tool. Here's my tool of choice, a hacksaw, to deal with that piece of metal sticking up above the carbide cutter platform. And here's the end result. Now I switched bits and put a grinding wheel on there that was the same circumference as, or pretty close to, the carbide cutting wheel, and ran the tool through there slightly, just got a catch, slightly below the bottom so I didn't mess that up, and grinded the back side of where the cutter would be so it matches it round. It's kind of like just aesthetics. It's not really needed, but I just did it anyway to match more of the Easy Wood tool design. Here is the finished rough shape where the carbide cutter will sit. I used 220 sandpaper to clean up the inside of the grinding marks, and it came out pretty well. And then I just dry fitted the cutter in there to see if it fit, and it was great. I also traced the carbide cutter bottom and took it to the belt sander and rounded the front. Brought it over to the drill press and clamped it down. I marked a hole in the center where the cutter would be, so the cutter edges would hang over the side, and sprayed it with some WD-40, getting ready to drill it with a number 29 drill bit. The screw is an 8 by 32 NC, which you would want the 8 by 32 tap as well. And looks like some of that WD-40 got away on me. Actually, it worked pretty well. I don't usually use specific cutting oil. And I drilled all the way through, out to the other side. The screw that I have doesn't go all the way through, so it doesn't matter if there's a hole in the bottom or not. You can use the screw that came with it, or you can buy a separate one. You want to make sure you lubricate often to cut down on heat, and move the drill bit in and out, and drill slowly. Take your time. Now I just tapped the hole that we made with a 8 by 32 tap. Make sure it's straight up and down, and you can take it slow in and out, and lubricate often. Then I just make sure the screw fits, and it does. I was pretty happy. Unfortunately, I ended up stripping this screw and had to add another one. Then I just took an orbital sander with 220 grit sandpaper and cleaned up all the edges of the bar to make it look shiny. Pretty happy with that finish. Nice and shiny. I chose ash wood for my handle. It's 20 inches long, and I marked the center on both sides. Also, it is 2 by 2, the wood. I used my table saw to cut the handle down the middle into 2 equal parts. On the right, before I made my cut, I marked all 4 sides the depth of the bar in the handles, and also to remember the grain. Now I'm going to use my router table with a 1/2 inch mortising bit sticking up about 1/4 inch, and I'm going to route 2 channels, one on each side of the piece of handles to fit the steel in, and then later they'll be sandwiched and glued together. Here I run both boards through the router table. I only show the process of one, but the other one is the same. Also, you can see here I am all about safety. I keep my hands away from blades at all times whenever possible. Here are the complete boards. One is actually a little bit longer than the other, so I put it back on the router table to fix that problem with a stop block. Now I glue both pieces together. I used an Ultimate Wood Glue by Type Bond. It's what I had lying around. I applied it with an acid brush and smeared it all over, attempting not to get it in any of the router grooves. Before I sandwich the two pieces together and put them in the clamps, I'll put the bar in there to make sure it fits evenly, and then once it's clamped, I'll just pull the bar out and let it glue for a day. In the back of my mind, I really need to remember that my body parts are in front of the camera. Here's a little shot of the wood being clamped. Meanwhile, I'll prepare the ferrule out of the copper pipe coupling. It is 3/4 inches, and as you can see, it goes over a 3/4 pipe, so it's a little bit bigger, which gives me a little bit more room for the tenon. It's a pipe cutter to cut the ferrule. It's about 1 inch long, which is most of my lathe tool ferrules. And I could have used a hacksaw, but this one was a clean cut. And now the really fun part, turning between centers. I started with a roughing gouge and trued up the blank to a round cylinder, and then moved on to a spindle detail gouge to shape the handle to a basic shape that matched pretty much all my rest of my tools. And then I made a few lines and burned the lines in with some wire. I made a tenon and used my calipers to make sure it was the right size to fit the copper ferrule over it, and I glued that in place with some epoxy. I then proceeded on to everybody's favorite, sanding. Started at 120 and went to 400 grit. I decided to use a CA finish, and I applied a few coats. I sanded the CA to about 400 grit and then used micro mesh pads all the way up to 12,000. And as you can see here, I wet sand with my micro mesh pads and my abrasives to prolong their life and to cut down on any burning. I finished CAs with a plastic polish as a final step. I am buffing that out right now at about 2,000 RPMs. I then attach the steel bar into the handle with a 2-part 5-minute epoxy.